Oh, I'm so sorry. It looks like I baited you again with one of my jingoist edits. Welcome to this episode of Mukashi. Here, instead of reading geopolitical matters, I am going to explain what influenced today's geopolitics through memory. And this time, we are going to treat about heroes, and more especially war heroes. The concept of war heroes can be seen as pretty paradoxical, honestly. What heroism can we find in a war? And most of the time, it really depends on the definition of hero itself. Hero can be a protagonist in the modern sense, but if we take a more classical sense, such as Greek and Roman myths, hero refers to one that accomplished certain act, mostly known as act of bravery. In the case of Japan, a war hero is something specific and even institutionalized. For example, we can have persons, military personnel, receiving certain honor, but the most important here is the concept of gunshi, which means god warrior or soldier god. And this inscribed itself in the Shintoist religion. And we are going to see today that this concept of spirit warrior is extremely important, as the war we treat today is linked to a change in Japanese religious activities. During the Meiji Revolution, instead of simply living in its Shinbutsu syncretism, which was the alliance of Buddhism and Shintoism, Meiji-era authorities instead completely tried to erase Buddhist influence and instead focused on Shintoist gods only, which led to the creation of this concept of gunshi. And what's important here is the institutionalization of something spiritual. In this episode, we are going to treat about Japanese war hero and especially those of the Russo-Japanese War, which opposed the two eponym countries. And while this war was an astonishing victory for Japan and a crushing defeat on the moral sense for Russia, and even though the victory was quite pyrrhic, for Japan this explosion of patriotism was helped by the appearance of certain war hero. Today I am going to count the story and explain the importance of 4 war hero. And let's start with the least known and probably one of the most symptomatic of this divinization. Just like many wars of this century, the Russo-Japanese War starts quite enthusiastically on every side. The Russian side imagined that this will only be a colonial expedition, while for the Japanese they seem quite confident in their alliance with the UK. Among the many conscripts enrolled for this war are some quite experienced officers such as Tachibana Shuta. This officer, known especially for being an aide for members of the imperial family, is known as a war hero in Japan for his courage and tenacity in front of the Russian army. However, and this is quite symptomatic of this period, the reality is sometimes quite disappointing. In order to take Port Arthur, where the majority of Russian forces were stationed, Japan had to advance from its Korean possession, and this is where Tachibana intervened. The Battle of Liaoyang opposed Japanese and Russian force quite early in the war. And what's noticeable with this battle is the amount of casualties on both sides, and especially on the Japanese one. Even though they won, the number of wounded and dead soldiers is more important than on the Russian side, which attests of the tactic used at this time, which was quite just like what could be seen in the future first part of World War I. Japanese used a sort of human wave tactic, which implies of course a lot of soldiers. And unlike in the Russian army, who also used a mass infantry tactic, Japanese used this one not because of class difference, where Russian officials of the aristocracy had to defend their position against peasants. On the Japanese side, it was more motivated by the defense of the country against a major threat, which made quite a lot of regiments quite enthusiastic at the beginning of the war, which wouldn't be the case later, and especially during the siege of Port Arthur. And as you can note, I haven't developed much on Tachibana actions. It is because he is known for getting shot immediately after leaving a trench while disobeying orders. However, despite this act of insubordination, he was reminded for his courageous nature. Nowadays in Kyushu you can see statues of him, and in his hometown you can even visit a shrine where his god warrior soul is enshrined. Contrary to Shuta, Hirose represents a different aspect of Japanese military, the international side, as Hirose Takeo studied in Russia, for example. He even met a Russian woman there, namely Ryadna Kovalskaya. This experience, just like Admiral Togo had with British and American Navy, cemented him as a different figures. He was not a sworn enemy of Russia, but he was just an unfortunate opponent of a country he probably genuinely loved. His act of bravery was not of a conquering one, but of compassion. During the blockade of Port Arthur, after his ship was hit by torpedoes, he attempted to save one of his soldiers named Sugino. Unfortunately, he had to went down with the ship. His act was reminded by Japanese officials quite quickly, and like many heroes of this war, he not only earned a song dedicated to his act, but also statues and more generally the public recognition, which is still present today on the Diet Library, for example. Here the religious fact enters. For Shintoism, when someone dies, their spirit does not really leave our world, they are still present, and it's up to us to keep their memory alive, which is why remembering these war heroes is so important, whereas for Abrahamic religions, for example, there are no higher god to protect and judge those who have passed away. Therefore, this is why perhaps some of these heroes are sometimes idealized beyond reasons. Although for Hirose, his act of compassion allowed him to keep a quite positive image even today. We can see this memory being transmitted to newer generation in Japanese movie making, for example with the TV drama Saka no Ue no Kumori, where Hirose is featured as one of the characters here. We will see in another part that, dying in the same fashion on the Russian side, was not seen as anything heroic. Unfortunately for us, you cannot really visit much monuments dedicated to him in Japan. However, you can still visit his soul in Oita Prefecture, where his shrine is located, as sadly his statue in Tokyo was removed by American occupation authorities. While Hirose represented a more compassionate side of war, General Nogi represents a more grim aspect of war. The siege of Port Arthur by Japanese forces was not only long but also costly in terms of lives, and General Nogi especially lost two of his sons during the assault on the Russian positions. At this time, without tanks and without more advanced artillery, it was extremely difficult for the Japanese forces to penetrate what was known as the Constantinople of the East, the fortress of Port Arthur, which was one of, if not the most fortified place in the world at that time, thanks to extensive investment by the Russian army. Nogi was retained by history as the victor of this battle, thanks to a mix of attrition but also thanks to the ability of Russian General Costelle to surrender in time before even more catastrophic assault happened. The story doesn't stop at Port Arthur. After the war, General Nogi was regretful, to say the least. He even asked the Emperor Meiji directly to commit seppuku, as the regret was too strong for him, losing his sons but also his soldiers in suicidary actions such as the assault of Shirotazuki, which precedes kamikaze attacks of the next war. Emperor Meiji refused that, of course, and he would only commit seppuku with his wife only in 1912, when Emperor Meiji passed away. General Nogi has been especially popularized after that sacrifice, a sign for Japanese nationalism of lineage with samurai who were known to commit seppuku should their master died. Even if that was not the case historically, that's how Japanese history was taught at the time. On the pop culture side, there had been some movies about the siege of Port Arthur, and one of the most noticeable was a movie from the 80s called Hill 203 in Japanese. And this movie portrays well the sorrow of General Nogi, who is regretful and not extremely enthusiastic at the idea of seeing his men dying in battle. Even though necessary, those actions broke his mind, to say the least. If you ever go to Japan, you can visit Nogi and his spirit at Nogi Shrine in Tokyo. The Battle of Tsushima is the apogee of the Russo-Japanese War, and if the Japanese victory was caused by many factors such as the decay of Russian Navy and its extremely difficult travel around the world, it is important to acknowledge the architect of this victory, namely Togo Heihachiro, Admiral of the Japanese fleet. The victory on Tsushima does not only represent the victory of a smaller country against one of the largest land empire in the world, which was also the case during the Mongol invasion of Japan, It also represents the end of an era where countries who were meant to be colonized, countries who are not European, are able to defend themselves against the so-said colonial power. Moreover, Admiral Togo also represents samurai spirit, as he was one of the Satsuma domain during the Boshin War. Today, Togo remains as one of the most important Japanese personality of the period, and his memory is quite living contrary to the three others, as his ship, the Mikasa, is still well preserved in the harbor of Yokosuka, and every year there are celebrations organized on the 27th of May to commemorate the victory on the Russian Baltic Fleet, including a concert. And if you pass by Japan, you can also visit the grave of Togo in Tama Cemetery, which attests of the importance of the character in Japanese modern history and remains one of the least controversial Japanese military known to public, especially for its positive relation with Admiral Chester Nimitz, who funded the renovation of Mikasa. Also, contrary to General Nogi, which had a quite tragic end of career, Admiral Togo remained important in Japanese politics for quite a long time, and was even the tutor of Emperor Hirohito. Overall, and attested by his worldwide followed funerals, Admiral Togo Heihachiro remains one of the most important characters of Japanese history. And if you want to visit him nowadays, visit the shrine in Harajuku, or even go to Mikasa Museum, which is one of the last remaining battleship you can visit in the world. I believe a short note is necessary on the Russian case. Tsarist Russia hadn't known many success in the year preceding its fall. Ever since the Crimean War, Russia was kind of decaying from the inside, as the rapid industrial revolution here caused massive shift in the society, which led to even more tension between the working classes and, of course, the aristocracy. Over the many officers who served under the Tsarist banner during this war, not much has been retained in history for multiple reasons, not only for their defeats, and what a defeat in Tsushima for Admiral Rozhizvensky Zivoni, which was known as a quite impulsive officer by his peers, but there are also bigger losers, to say the least, such as General Stessel, who was even punished by death by the Tsar, hopefully pardoned a bit later for the loss of Port Arthur, and some even die in extremely unceremonious ways, such as Admiral Makarov, whose ship was hit by a sea mine, or General Kondradenko, who died in his bunker hit by a shell. Overall, the lack of memory in Russia can be explained by the succession of defeats, but also by the absence of major territorial loss in this war. Nowadays, none of these heroes are honored by anyone, and even the places who were named after this hero have been controversial, to say the least, such as Stepan Makarov, whose memory was victim of Ukraine wars because Ukrainian authorities decided to dename one of the places dedicated to him, as he was seen as a symbol of Russian imperialism. To modern audience, all of this can be seen as pretty remote from daily life struggles. And while this is true, history still matters in the mind of leaders. Vladimir Putin has taken history, and especially the conflicts against Japan, as justification for its policy in Korean Islands, for example, or as a tool to get closer to China, for example, renaming V-Day to Victory Day against Imperial Japan. Concerning the Japanese side, memory of the Russo-Japanese War is not used that much. Even Victory Day is not a public holiday here. However, there is the potentiality that more chauvinistic, to say the least, leaders of Japan could retake that history to their advantage. Let's to see how they will use it. Overall, what was also important for me to understand here are the notion of war hero and what they actually hide. Usually, war heroes are created by propaganda for multiple reasons and not always that mischievous all the time. That was the case for Tachibana Shuta, who represented that idea of the perfect soldier who is ready to disobey order for the glory of Japan, while other figures such as Nogi or Hirose are more important for a compassionate side of war, because at that time Japan was trying to appear as a extremely civilized nation and even more than its Western peers. And of course, Togo represented something more important for the nation as this kind of victor, the perfect victory, as the Battle of Tsushima, like many naval battles of that time, wasn't that bloody, to say the least, compared to land battles such as the Battle of Port Arthur. Overall, what's important to remind in the Japanese memory of war of this period is not only the victory against a larger opponent, but also how different stories can be used by a country in order to motivate its troops, but also justify its victory as a moral victory. Unfortunately, the first victim in a war is truth, and often in the veil of war, heroes that are seen as necessary are created even though not real, and that was the case, for example, with the Ghost of Kiev during the early Ukraine war. Lastly, and that will be my conclusion, the heroization of soldiers during the Russo-Japanese War also helped that narrative that other wars had more honor, where this was of course not the case. Russo-Japanese War was extremely bloody for its short period of time, and especially on the Japanese side, which often had more victims than on the Russian side. And those heroes sadly hide a reality where peasants, prisoners, teachers and workers were conscripted during that war to die and serve under the orders of a samurai lineage aristocracy, only to be forgotten in their majority.
この世に生きとし生けるもののすべての命に限りがあるのならば